Adam Smith, known as the father of modern capitalism, was a moral philosopher, author, and economist, best known for his work An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. Since this publication, he's become somewhat of a messianic figure among conservatives, libertarians, and right-wing economists. However, the actual opinions and moral stances of Adam Smith have been simplified and sanitized to suit the needs of a particularly narrow view. The real Adam Smith is much more subtle and interesting. It's important to understand that Adam Smith wrote his works before the Industrial Revolution, which means he formulated his ideas in a pre-capitalist world, much different from the economy of today, one full of merchants and manufacturers. Smith, like other early Enlightenment figures, could not have foreseen the rise of industrial capitalism, let alone the modern corporation. At the time, the government in Britain was largely in the hands of the aristocracy. The upper classes had something of a snobbish disdain for commerce and trade. Most aristocrats saw the ownership of land as the most stable and most appropriate source of wealth for a respectable family. Smith's pre-capitalist idea of free trade was based on the idea that everyone controlled their own labor, but the capitalist revolution introduced a crucial change from price to wage. The idea of renting oneself to an owner and having your livelihood defined by a clock was completely antithetical to the idea of classical liberalism. Smith could never have imagined an economy where the actions of individuals are not based on their own volition, but come from the coercive logic of the system, either rent yourself or starve. But even if we place Smith's works in our current economic model, his ideas are not as laissez-faire as they're portrayed. We've all read the first few pages of Wealth of Nations, where Smith extols the virtues of self-seeking, where he states, "It's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest." However, throughout the rest of the text, Adam Smith points out that division of labor has broader social implications. He argues that repetitive, separated work leads to a decline in self-command and critical thinking, leaving the worker vulnerable to superstitious reasoning and absurd beliefs. Smith addresses this, saying the worker, who has no occasion to exert his understanding or to exercise his invention, naturally loses the habit of such exertion and generally becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human to become. He predicted that without state intervention, the merchants and manufacturers would carry out what he called the vile maxim of the masters of mankind, by which he meant their mindset would be all for ourselves and nothing for other people. Adam Smith was in favor of government intervening when it was on behalf of the majority of workers, saying, "But in every improved and civilized society, this is the state into which the laboring poor, that is, the great body of people, must necessarily fall unless the government takes some pains to prevent it." He goes on in the text to list a whole host of radical arguments, like every tax, however, to the person who pays it is a badge, not of slavery, but of liberty. And it is not very unreasonable that the rich should contribute to the public expense, not only in proportion to their revenue, but something more than in that proportion. He also wrote, "Whenever there is great property, there is great inequality. For one very rich man, there must be at least 500 poor, and the affluence of the few supposes the indigence of the many." And all this is just from Wealth of Nations. Few people know that Smith wrote another magnum opus called Moral Sentiments, his major work about sympathy and how a surplus of wealth should allow society to look after its weakest members, granting us the ability to lead more fully realized lives outside a market system. Smith argued that we have needs that go beyond economics, like music, art, and a rewarding social life. Smith saw consumers, not producers, as the primary beneficiaries of the free market system. This is completely opposed to capitalism, where its main function is not to produce things to satisfy human need, but rather to produce things that create a profit for the owners of capital. In a passage that could be mistaken for something out of the Communist Manifesto, Adam Smith wrote, "Consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production. The interest of the producer ought to be attended to only so far as it may be necessary for promoting that of the consumer. This maxim is so perfectly evident that it'd be absurd to attempt to prove it. But the interest of the consumer is almost certainly sacrificed to that of the producer, and it seems to consider production, not consumption, as the ultimate end and object of all industry and commerce." Even Smith's most famous concept, the idea of the invisible hand, has been twisted to fit a view contrary to Smith's own. He uses the phrase twice, once in Moral Sentiments and once in Wealth of Nations. In Moral Sentiments, he used it to explain how wealth and land would be distributed in a way that benefits society by ensuring an egalitarian outcome. In Wealth of Nations, he used it once as an argument against what today we would call neoliberal globalization. Both uses have nothing to do with what we call the free market and are actually critiques against it. Our contemporary understanding of Adam Smith is based on a few cherry-picked quotes, removed from their context, out of one of his many books, written in an anachronistic period before the capitalist revolution. Adam Smith is worshipped by the right, not read. Economist Richard Wolff commented saying, "If you actually read Smith's Wealth of Nations, you will quickly see how nuanced Smith actually was, how critical of many aspects of private capitalism he was, and so on." For example, Karl Marx credited Adam Smith with major insights crucial to the basic critique of capitalism, dimensions of Smith's work which the crude mainstream economists ignore or simply don't know. Thanks for watching.